Okay, let's dive right into one of the biggest, oldest puzzles in all of philosophy: how we talk about God. The problem, when you boil it down, is actually pretty simple, but wow, it is profound. How do we even begin to use our limited human words to describe a being that is, by its very definition, supposed to be limitless and completely beyond our understanding?
So that really forces us to ask a tough question. If God is truly infinite, truly unknowable, can anything we say about God actually mean, well, anything? It's this massive paradox, right? And today we're going to look at two huge historical attempts to try and solve it.
And this, right here, this is the heart of the problem. Look at the two columns. On one side, you've got religions using these really familiar positive words we can all understand. God is loving, God is powerful, God is wise, but then in the very same breath, they insist God is beyond all human understanding, infinite, incomprehensible. So, which is it? Are our words actually getting at something real, or are they just empty labels we're sticking on a total mystery?
So the first major solution we're going to tackle takes a really radical approach. It basically suggests that maybe, just maybe, we're coming at this from the completely wrong angle. Instead of trying to pin down what God is, what if the only meaningful thing we can do is talk about what God is not?
This idea is called the via negativa, which literally just means the way of negation. Thinkers like Pseudo-Dionysius argued that any positive statement we make, like saying God is wise, inevitably puts God into a small, limited, human-sized box. And to avoid that, they said, we have to stick only to negation. We can't say what God is, we can only ever say what God isn't.
So how in the world is that supposed to work? Well, the philosopher Maimonides came up with this great analogy of a ship. Picture this: someone has never ever seen a ship. So you start by telling them everything a ship is not. You say, okay, it's not a mineral, it's not a plant, it's not a perfect sphere. With every single thing you negate, they actually get a little closer to picturing what a ship might be. The idea is, this exact same process can bring us nearer to an understanding of God.
But the goal here is actually even deeper. For these thinkers, when we say something like, God is not darkness, it doesn't automatically mean God is light. No. It means God is totally beyond our human categories of light and dark. The whole point is to train your mind to stop trying to cram God into these tiny intellectual boxes and instead just stand in awe of a profound mystery.
As you can probably guess, though, this super radical idea got some pretty serious pushback. For a lot of people, just talking about what God is not, well, it felt like it was gutting religion of its meaning, of what believers actually feel and want to say.
And one of the most famous critiques came from the heavyweight philosopher Thomas Aquinas. He put it so simply. He argued that the via negativa is just not what people want to say when they talk about God. Think about it. When someone of faith is praying, they're not trying to chip away at a concept with negations. They believe they're saying something positive, something real and meaningful. And you know what? Aquinas has a really solid point, and it's backed up by religious texts themselves. The Bible is just filled with positive statements. It doesn't say God is not hate. It says flat out, God is love. In Exodus, God even describes himself using a very human, positive term, jealous. A purely negative approach just seems to fly in the face of how religious language is actually used in the real world.
So, if saying what God is seems impossible, and only saying what God is not feels empty and unsatisfying, what's left? Where do you go from here? Well, Aquinas proposed a third way, a middle path that tries to avoid both of those extremes. He called it the theory of analogy. To really get this, we first have to see what Aquinas rejected. First, he said we can't use what's called univocal language, where a word means the exact same thing in two different contexts. For example, the good in a good baker is not the exact same kind of goodness as God's goodness. But he also rejected equivocal language, where a word means something totally different. That would just make our statements about God completely meaningless. The answer, he said, had to be somewhere in between.
So here's the first part of his big idea, the analogy of attribution. The logic is actually pretty straightforward. Since God is the creator, the source of everything good in the world, things like love, wisdom, justice, then we can attribute those qualities back to their source. God must possess the qualities that he causes in his own creation. Makes sense, right? And here's the second piece of the puzzle, and it's absolutely crucial. The analogy of proportion. Aquinas says, yes, God has these qualities, but he has them in a way that is proportional to his infinite nature. So think of it this way. Our human love is proportional to our finite, limited existence.
God's love, on the other hand, is proportional to his infinite, unlimited existence. The quality is related, yeah, but it's on a completely different scale.
And this whole idea isn't just pulled out of thin air. It has a theological foundation that comes straight from Scripture. That famous line in Genesis, that humans are created in God's image and likeness, suggests there's a real connection, a fundamental similarity that makes this whole project of using analogy even possible.
Now, Aquinas' theory was, and still is, incredibly influential. But of course, the story doesn't end there. Modern critics have come along and asked some really tough questions. The biggest one, does this bridge of analogy that Aquinas built actually hold any weight? Does it really tell us anything we don't already know?
And really, the modern critique all comes down to this one super simple question. For any analogy to actually work, don't you have to have some understanding of both sides of the comparison? Let's take an analogy that works perfectly. If I say, electricity flows like water, that's helpful. Why? Well, because we have a pretty good grasp of what water is and how it behaves. We can use that knowledge of water to understand something new about electricity. And suddenly, concepts like current and flow just click.
But see what happens when we try to do the same thing with God. We hit a massive wall. Saying God's love is like human love is a huge problem. We know the human side of that equation, sure, but we have already admitted we have absolutely zero concept of the divine side. So we're comparing something we kind of know to something we've agreed is totally unknowable. What on earth does that comparison actually tell us?
And this leads to a really powerful critique from a philosopher named Vincent Brummer. He argued that at the end of the day, Aquinas' analogy takes us no further than a negative theology. After all, if all we can say is that God's love is proportional to his infinite nature, a nature we can't possibly grasp, then all we're really saying is that God's love is not like our love. And just like that, we're right back where we started with the via negativa.
So where does all this leave us? Well, it leaves us smack in the middle of a profound and seemingly unending philosophical debate. It's a fascinating and honestly a humbling look at the absolute limits of what our words can do. So here's the central tension all laid out. On one hand, you have the via negative. It does a great job of honoring the mystery of God, but it seems to empty religious language of any real positive meaning. On the other hand, you have the theory of analogy, which tries so hard to preserve that positive meaning, but it might be built on a comparison to a complete and total unknown.
Which leaves us with this final, massive question to chew on. When we're faced with something truly incomprehensible, what's the better path? Should we stay mostly silent, only daring to say what something is not? Or should we go ahead and use our flawed, imperfect human language, knowing it will always fall short? At the end of the day, is imperfect language better than no language at all?